Welcome to the Leading at the Next Level podcast with Dove Development Consulting. I'm Wes, and I have such a cool opportunity today to chat with Christian Shields. Christian Shields is literally a rock star. It's kind of cool. We say, hey, he's a rock star about different folks that are just good at what they do. Christian is really a rock star. He heads the Christian Shields band. He's a performing artist, but he does all the back end stuff. So before I butcher any of the things that Christian can explain in so much detail, Christian, how about you give an overview of your professional background, but kind of talk about your experience in the industry as a whole, because it's some really cool stuff.
Well, for those that don't know, I'm Christian Shields. I am a rock star, as you say, but no, I'm a musician, singer, songwriter, actor, entrepreneur, producer, so many hats. My experience in the business, I've got experience with booking, management, some accounting stuff. I basically, I'm a man of many hats when it comes to running my band and my business. And, I also have a hat on today. So as you can see, definitely man of many hats.
Man of many hats. Yeah, I get the opportunity to co-host on a buddy of mine's YouTube channel that he just has a massive reach. We love the 80s hairband genre. And he and his other guys that do the reactions and so on of different videos, several years ago, we said, hey, how about we start doing some interviews with these guys that we've loved listening to as we grew up, and just the folks that are carrying on the legacy that is music, that's the rock and roll genre, and so on and so forth. And that's where I got to meet Christian. And we got to really hear some of the back end parts. Christian talked about, here's what we do, here's what we look for when we perform, here's some of the different things. And it had me thinking, my goodness, there's nobody does what they do because everybody sees the limelight, everybody sees the what appears to be massive money that they're making, and so on and so forth. But the reality is, few people understand the back end that goes on to make sure that the shows happen, that the details, that if there are songs that are recorded, all that stuff behind it. And it really ties to the idea of purpose that I wrote about in early 2025 in Leading with a Clear Purpose. Christian, how about you talk about what that thing has been that's driven you? What's been the purpose? What have you really been after, and the impact that you want to make through music, through the way that you've structured your business?
Well, obviously it's going to make money. So obviously, that's definitely, part of it. But what's driven me is there's definitely a passion and a desire, not just for performing, but, to kind of change the culture of the music business, the way that it's done. Obviously people always hear about bands that, for lack of a better term, always get screwed. But, I think a lot of that stems from ignorance of just not knowing the business. Everybody always forgets that second word, business. It's not just it's not just music. It's the music business. So I definitely decided, especially with this band, after being in different bands, to take on more of a role of learning all the different facets and jobs that go into this. Because before I outsource or hire anybody else to do things, because at some point, it's just not feasible to do everything yourself. So especially if you want to keep your sanity. So before I do that, because I've already started hiring, people to do other things, as it's growing and expanding, I would definitely want to know what's going on, so that way I can understand what they're doing. And then that way I could identify if some shady stuff is going on. Not saying it will, but I just think that just because you're the leader, the manager, whatever, you do need to know everything else that's going on.
I loved how you just put that. One of my very best friends, we work closely with them. And matter of fact, the book that I've got coming out in early 2026 is called The Values Advantage. And they're kind of the case study for the book. The dad, the husband, if you will, in the family business, he was the CEO of a large company that did close to $1 billion in revenue and just did some amazing things. But he stepped away from that and said, I want to have a family business. And I'm watching him with his son, his daughter-in-law, and his daughter, have them actively involved in every facet of the business for that reason. There's stuff that they'll never be able to master, and that's not their goal, but they'll become competent in every aspect, because as I'm going to say the young folks, they're in their mid 20s and they're amazing they're his kids. So I'm going to call them kids because they're younger than my kids, but they're amazing. And I love seeing what they're doing. They're not going to master those things, but as they grow and take ownership of that business over time, nobody can blow smoke up their skirts, right? They'll know exactly if they're being BS.
Right.
I loved how you said that and just understanding that. Now, Christian, you talked about it. It's not all glamorous. There's a lot of work behind the scenes. There's a lot of things that you've had to work and do for the business side of what you do. Talk to me a little bit about, and this is really, you touched on this on the Hops Metal Show conversation. Who do you look to serve through what you do? Who do you want to impact, and what impact do you want to leave, whether it's through the live shows, videos like Fall Like Rain, or whatever it is you're doing? What's the impression you want to leave on people?
Well, see, it's definitely multifaceted as well. So definitely you want to leave a good impression with the audience. You know, they're the consumer of the product. If we want to speak in business terms and how people actually speak in the music business, they call, you know, your product and everything is, you know, content or whatever. I mean, a lot of people get the ick when they hear those words, but that's the terminology that's used. Anyway, put that aside. But definitely, want to make sure that the audience, the customer, you know, whatever, they're happy. They feel like they get their money's worth. And then also like behind the scenes, the professionalism. You want to be accountable. You want to make sure that your communication's good, you know, because to have a successful show is not necessarily just to have, you know, a venue that's packed. You know, people see that and that's great. But if you were rude to the venue or, you know, you were difficult to deal with, you didn't show up on time, all that stuff, well, you know, that can jeopardize you getting booked there in the future. So, you know, again, as far as the impact, it's not just necessarily the audience. You also want the people that you work with in the industry. You also want to be easy to work with, and you want to be, you know, you definitely want to be accountable. That's the word I want to use.
Yep. And that's not isolated to music. That's in every industry. When Cindy and I go to speak with a group, whether it's a dozen, 15, 20, or if it's several thousand business owners in an association, same deal. How do we make sure that we're delivering? Because the product is, what can they walk away with? In our case, how can they put it in place and capture profitability in their industry? In your case, it's how do we have a cool experience that we just truly enjoy and it inspires us in some way? And it's a big deal. It's the service that we provide. So if somebody doesn't like that term, they don't understand business even a little bit, right?
Well, I mean, that's okay. Not everybody's necessarily cut out to be a leader, or not everybody's a visionary. Not everybody's a creative. So there takes a certain, and that's a skill set in its own. So it takes a certain, you know, person, you know, usually the people who complain the loudest about, you know, this company's making all this money and all that stuff are people who are not creatives. They're consumers. Mm-hmm. So it's unfortunate that, you know, that dichotomy exists, but it does. And, you know, not everybody is cut out for it.
Yeah. And I love seeing somebody win and be successful because I understand the risks that they took in the process, because it's tremendous. Yeah, we won't go into that in a whole lot of detail because
but we love, you know, you love it. That's another thing. You know, I guess maybe there's a type of some type of adrenaline junkie type stuff, you know, the equivalent of guys who jump out of an airplane. Some people get their rocks off by, you know, let me throw around this amount of money. And, you know, it's almost like a form of gambling, you know, but it's a little bit more controlled chaos, I guess. And, you know, maybe we do it because even though we get incredibly stressed at times, not sure if things are going to work out, but then if it does work out and you wipe the sweat off your brow, you're like, oh, let's do it again.
Yes, indeed. You know? Yep. Praise God we didn't go bankrupt. Let's try it again.
Yes.
Yeah. And we chatted a little bit before. We won't go into this in detail, but when you're writing a song or you're writing or putting together a full album, you're doing the production, you're just coming up with the whiteboard, if you will, for the music and stuff. It's not terribly different. I would argue it's significantly more talent involved than what I do for writing a book or creating a lesson or whatever. But it's the same process, that there's a ton of time and energy invested before anybody ever sees it. And to be able to do it well in front of people, we've put a hell of a lot of work into it, right?
Well, of course. And then there's definitely a team of people. You know, a lot of times people don't realize, but some of their favorite artists don't necessarily write their biggest songs. Mm-hmm. Or they don't necessarily even play on their biggest songs. You know, sometimes a track is handed to them and all that stuff. you know, you got to be open-minded because it's definitely a team of people. And, you know, sometimes bands will try stuff because they're trying to work an angle and all that stuff. You know, the process, like, sure, I could record a song at home and it'll be a good song, but, you know, I tend to, again, this is where you take more of a business approach. I go in with a producer, we go in with a team, usually my guitar player, my producer, and I, sometimes other people, and then we craft a demo, do the sound design, get it, you know, because again, you're creating a product. I know people don't like to hear it like that, but obviously we're creating a song. We hope that people will like it. And, you know, obviously it has to start with a good idea and all that. But, you know, people just don't understand necessarily that aspect. And then if you get labels involved, they typically want to put their, you know, imprint on it. And then there's definitely other business things. Like, you got to think about, okay, how are we going to market this? You know, especially with the video, you know, are we going to put out different content, you know, TikTok videos, all this stuff. So sure, I could just put out a song and whatever, but typically, you know, just use as an example, because that's my wheelhouse, is one aspect of promotion and marketing and all that stuff is, you know, it's not just necessarily, ooh, I got this cool song idea, what can we do? It's, I'm already thinking of the 9 different angles of all the content, all the videos, anything you could think of that has to do with it. You know, I'm thinking of every single angle, everything, because you got to.
Yeah. And I love that you're sharing this detail, because I'm relating it to, it's exactly the process that I've gone through with books. And as I'm working on my first 3 have been self-published, and it's kind of, and it's funny because I actually asked when I was writing the first one, a friend of mine, he is now the CEO of a large printing company. And I says, hey, can we print these with you? And before, he was the COO of another large company that owns some pretty big publishers that you'd be familiar with. And he said, well, Wes, you're not patient enough for this. You self-publish your first couple, and then I'll make some connections for you later on. And we did it. But your point's so solid, in that now that we're getting into a different space, we're starting to get other people to put, I'm going to say, their fingerprint, and they're giving outside opinions and advice that we didn't necessarily have. And it's so critical to make sure that I can reach a certain amount of people, but with more vested input. Anybody can give input, but I want vested input. We can reach more people the right way. So I love how you share that with videos and TikTok and so on and so forth.
I'm just giving examples, of course. It's not necessarily one right way or whatever, but definitely the vested interest thing is key. But again, when it comes to like labels and all that stuff, people, like, they forget they're trying to make money. Okay. They're not going to be like, oh, we like this band, they're great, let's just put them out and lose $1 million on them. That's not happening. If they're not making money, then that A&R guy who signed you is getting fired. Like, that's how it works.
Yep. 100% correct.
It's brutal. It has such a high, and that's just one aspect. You know, there's such a high turnover rate with that.
Yep. Now, you talked about, and this was the big reason I said, hey, do you want to come on the Leading at the Next Level podcast and chat a little bit about it? Talk to me about one of your core values and what you've looked for in who you want to work with as a band, who you want to work with as producers, and all different aspects, because you've talked about, hey, it's not just about the money. I want to make sure our values are aligned and it's not a constant fight.
Well, I definitely think, principled is definitely one of the main things. Is like, what are we trying to do here? You know, we got to stick to our guns through thick and thin. That doesn't mean that we don't have any wiggle room to kind of go in a different direction. You know, I always equate that, unfortunately, with a lot of business stuff. You know, there is almost like a cycle of abuse where people won't challenge the orthodoxy. They won't challenge the way things are done. They'll be, and this will definitely certainly applies in the music business, where, you know, somebody can be nice, but then when it comes to business, you'll be like, wow, why are they really, you know, not pleasant? And then when you ask them, they'll be like, well, this is the way it's done. And usually, to me, that's the ultimate cop-out answer. It means that, like, no. So I think that one of the things that sets me apart, and especially the people that I work with, and I make sure that, you know, with the band members, with the producers, with anybody that I hire, the goal is, we don't necessarily have to burn it all down. That's not what I'm talking about. We don't necessarily have to totally challenge the power structures and all that of the music business. It's just that I don't want to be unpleasant towards people. I don't want to treat anybody less than. I just think that the cycle of abuse that is the music business, as I continue to rise, or just in any business, and you know what I mean,
Sure.
as I continue to hopefully rise in prominence, I just want to break that cycle a little bit and show people that there's a different way that it can be done. If you want to run that other rat race, fine. But I'm not here to change your mind. I'm just, I believe in actions speak louder than words. So I'm hoping that I can just show it can be done a different way. That's it. Not here to dethrone anybody. I'm just you do your thing over there, and do my thing over here. That's it.
I take the same approach with every client that we work with, every group we get to speak with. The call to action that I leave with is, hey, if you treat people right, eventually you'll build a culture. And please know, when I say that, I believe in incredibly high expectations and extreme accountability for anything that somebody's expected to do. But let's value the heck out of people in the process and make sure they know that in any industry. And when we do, we can attract some of the best people in our respective industries, right? Good people want to be around that. Bad people,
Yes.
good people don't want to be around all that other garbage, regardless of what it's just icky. Let them have it. You like you said, you do that over there. We'll stay over here and we'll win. How about that? So talk to me about one of the best opportunities you've had. You don't need to name the organization, but talk about an organization or whether it's a label, a producer, someone that you've worked with where you saw a values alignment and it made your life so much simpler to be able to work with people that had that same values alignment with you.
Well, I would just say in general, it's probably the team that I work with. Like we're pretty much, we know what the vision is, we know what we're trying to do. And, there's no like infighting. There's no, and, it's pretty much, again, I'm keeping it vague a little bit. It's just pretty much that, when push comes to shove and time to get work done, it gets done, and there's very little argument and very little resistance. It's definitely smooth sailing. Not to make an aside, but if you have infighting or disagreement on something, then there's not clear boundaries or vision that has been outlined, and that's usually when I think those conflicts arise. When people talk about creative differences in the music business, that's usually not what it's about. It usually means that there's a money disagreement, but put that aside for a second. But I'm saying, but even so, with other situations, it's usually there's not clear defined boundaries and vision. And again, I kept that vague on purpose because I don't want to leave anybody out, because it's not necessarily an organization per se, because right now, I'm independent and all that stuff, but there could be things on the horizon that would change that, and I know people would argue, why don't you stay independent? But it's like, at some point, if you want to grow the business, I can only take it so far with the capital and knowledge and connections that I have. And then sometimes you kind of have to, as you move up the ladder, you kind of have to, go to the next thing.
100% relate. And everything that you said applies in every industry. Cindy and I get to work in a lot of different industries. We don't actively work in the music industry. That's a little bit different, but we're fans, right? But every segment of the business world that we deal with, those exact things, if we're not clear in our expectations, if we don't have massively open communication, there's going to be problems. Creative differences arise in every industry. That's so cool. Now, I referenced earlier your most recent video, Fall Like Rain, and in the show notes, wherever somebody accesses this, they'll be able to get links to your website, christianshields.net, your Patreon, your Facebook, your X, and your YouTube channel. That video is killer. If that's the one you want to talk about, great. But tell me an example of something where you felt like, hey, we just nailed it and we left a positive imprint on the people that we want to touch.
Well, I definitely think with this one, we nailed it with this one, and then we're already kind of, you always got to be looking at the next thing that's on the horizon. But definitely this is, with the This Is Rock and Roll record, it was basically me, guitar player, and a producer. There was no band yet. So this, I'm glad, even though, yes, it's the Christian Shields band, and, it's my solo band, but I didn't necessarily do it as an ego stroke. Again, not to go back, I should have added this to the last thing, but, ego gets in the way when boundaries and expectations aren't set. But anyway, but I think definitely having everybody involved with this one, yeah, we nailed it. I mean, there's not much more that I can say. I'll say that with absolute confidence. And, that's my goal. There's not really, when I listen to that track and I watch the video, it's like there's not anything I'm going back saying, man, maybe we should have. Nope. So, and sometimes that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you just got to make a decision and you just put something out and you just got to live with it. And, because there comes a point of the sunken cost fallacy where it's like, you're going to sink any more time or any more money or whatever. Sometimes you just got to kind of, whatever. And sometimes that's like lightning in a bottle. You'll put it out like that and then it'll explode and all that stuff. But again, like at this level, things are more of a slow burn, because again, it's definitely, financial stuff. Like obviously the more money you have, the faster you can make things move, but not always, because there's still other roadblocks that you can run into, because you can sink a lot of money into, whatever and get nowhere.
You use the term lightning in a bottle. Have you experienced a scenario where you just, gosh, we got to get this done. We got to get it out. It's not quite where we want it to be, but you've released a song and the feedback, whether it's from live shows or the folks hearing it on the different streaming platforms or whatever, just rave about it. And you're kind of like, yeah, didn't expect that.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say, because I've been fortunate, especially with this project, I've been fortunate to make sure that everything that I've done has definitely been deliberate and it's been to my satisfaction, or it doesn't get released. Maybe that's being a little bit of a control freak. No, I'm only teasing, but no, I've just been fortunate so far that those things have turned out exactly the way that I would have liked. And generally, I almost get nervous at the lack of haters. I know I'm kind of inviting them, but it's like, I just think that, not to toot my own horn, but, I meticulously crafted, this stuff. And not saying, like, when I say meticulous, I didn't necessarily mean I labored over it, but I had a clear vision of what I wanted to do. And when everything has reached that standard of, my vision and my satisfaction, so when I've put it out, the reception has always been positive and it continues to grow every day. And, that's all I can say.
Very cool. The lightning in the bottle really stuck with me because in complete transparency, my first book, it flowed. I enjoyed writing it and so on. The second book, I didn't. It was hard every single day. And I remember pushing away from my desk a bunch of days, Christian, and going, just not sure.
Sometimes it's like that, not to interrupt you, Wes, but to make another thing is that, a song that I wrote, like Rock and Roll, I say took me 5 minutes. It probably took longer than 5 minutes, but it was a flow. But maybe that's actually the lightning in a bottle moment, is that when I was in another band that ended, I had the riff, just the verse riff and the first verse, nothing else. I had it for years. Okay. And then when my other band that I was in before, the Christian Shields band, broke up and all that classic story, literally after maybe like an hour or so after that phone call or whatever that said we're done or whatever, I picked up my guitar. I started just playing that song randomly, but I didn't just stop at the first verse. I just kept playing and wrote the rest of the song right there. And it just came to me right there. So maybe it's an understanding of knowing that the other thing was over, so now I have to focus on this. I don't know. But maybe that would be more of like your lightning in a bottle moment, or an example of one. I'm sure there's been plenty of others. Like I said, there's been some back-end business stuff that, I could say, but either people won't believe me, like weird coincidences or being in the right place or right time or whatever, or it's people are just going to scratch their head and they're not going to understand the significance of the sequence of events. And I'm not saying that to disparage the audience or anybody like that. It's that unless you were there and you obviously have full understanding of all those aspects, it would be very hard to understand why it's lightning in a bottle moment and all that stuff. So again, not to disparage the audience, but like I said, I think the rock and roll one is an easier one to digest. And of course, over time, I'm sure I'll tell more stories as people ask me questions about stuff on different mediums and all that, and that'll be fun. But it's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
That's fantastic. Yeah. I don't remember which book. I think it's actually in both. A fellow named Napoleon Hill wrote two powerful, more than that, but two really powerful books. One's called Think and Grow Rich in 1937, and another one's called Master Key to Riches. I believe that was in the 60s, maybe 1965 it was released. But in both, he talked about the idea of the seed of every, in every adversity is the seed of an equal or greater benefit. And if we do the right things, good things are going to happen. And that's where you're talking about that. If we dig hard enough, we'll find something good in it.
Of course. And then also sometimes you plant as many seeds as you can because you never know when they'll bear fruit. You'll have opportunities, or you have people like I've met people from decades ago, literally decades ago. I know I look young, but I'm going to be 35. But I met people from decades ago that have now started to, I guess, create or be part of opportunities that are now occurring that I never would have thought of, 10, 20 years ago that would happen. But here we are.
100%. Yeah. And just a few weeks ago, Christian, my wife says, as I was trying to figure out how to put a stupid chat agent in one of our websites or courses. And she says, hey, are you going to continuously forever be looking for what's that next thing we can do? And my answer was, for right now, yeah. Every opportunity that I've got downtime, quote unquote, I'm going to put into how can we develop better systems for the busier we get, the more we can serve, the easier we can have the same kind of impact that we're trying to have. So it does come back somewhere down the road, but you've got to put those seeds out there. That's powerful.
Yep.
And
sometimes I'll say this, not before you ask a question. Everybody talks about, work smarter, not harder. And that's definitely true. But, sometimes a lot of times you'll do a grind for a while before you'll figure out a more efficient way to do it. And then what'll seem like you almost feel guilty. And this is maybe me and my work ethic. I'll feel like if I'm just sitting around on a day chilling or hanging out, I'll be like, oh man, I'm not working hard. But here's the thing. I already did the grind work to be able to be in that position to not to chill because my mind is still working, not necessarily me doing like a coding task or something like that. So that's where it would actually translate to that. To your point about downtime, obviously, yeah, you're always thinking about whatever, but there's only so many people you can talk to in a day. And, everybody talks about, you hear about entrepreneurs say about being workaholics and stuff. And that's true. I definitely am a workaholic, but at some point you do need to take some time for yourself and recharge, because if you're only running at like half capacity all the time, you'll notice that people will pick up on that and they'll be like a little bit more not invest. They'll be less likely to invest in your product or whatever you're trying to sell or do or build. But if you're like, if you take the time to rest and balance, sometimes I need to take my own advice, but sometimes you get enthusiastic about a project and you really just want to go till it's done. And that's not a bad thing either. But I feel like when you're 100%, you have a better vibe, and people will pick up on that.
And we do a bunch. And with the leaders that we interact with, one of the things that we challenge them to do is understand what recharges them, because what recharges you and what recharges my wife and what recharges me are probably all different things. And that's okay.
Yep.
We've got to understand that and make sure. For me, sitting at the beach with my feet kicked back is not recharging me, because I'm thinking about all this crap over here that, gosh, I could be doing this. So I take my work with me.
I'm with you. It's like when I tell people I'm not a leisure guy, they don't understand that. They're like, oh, it's just like, dude, I don't know how to explain it other than when I'm hanging out, I have to like really like convince myself it's okay. Because if I'm just sitting there doom scrolling on reels, not that I necessarily do that. I had to stop doing that because that becomes like a time suck. Like you got to know, like, certain things you just can't do. You got to know your limitations, but I just can't sit there and like you said, be at the beach. I mean, I've done it, but I'm just like, I'm sitting there the whole time and I just feel guilty. I feel like I have to get some work done.
Yeah. For
You
for
know?
me, Christian, I take our stuff with us. I mean, the last time we went, it was on our 25th anniversary 6 months ago, and
Mhm.
I took the laptop and the iPad. I wrote a chapter in a book, and it was just all this stuff. And I had amazing quality time with my very best friend and my business partner, who is both happened to be my wife. It's one person, but
Right. I figured.
but I got stuff done in the process, and that was fulfilling for me. But I still gave her the time she needed. So how do we make sure? And it's critical now. That really ties over to the next question I'll float to you, and talk about how the things that you valued most, and please know when I use the term leadership, Christian, it's not in the phase of what's your position, what's your title, are you a supervisor or manager. I
Right.
look at it from the thought process of we all impact other people, and we all carry some level of leadership influence. So when I'm asking this question, that's the framework. How have your core values, the things that mean the most to you, really driven you to invest the time, the energy, and the money to be in the best version of you so you can excel in your industry?
Well, definitely being a leader, or in the leader position of leadership, especially with the band, you can't. You again, actions speak louder than words. So, like, especially with my band, everybody has a clear, defined role, and I'm not just talking about the musicianship. When we're on the road, everybody has a job that they do, and basically, when we get to the venue or whatever, it's like clockwork. Everybody does the job, but if I'm finished with my job, for example, like if I'm setting up merch or something like that, or done doing the interview or whatever business stuff I have to do with other bands tour manager or whatever, I don't just go and sit down. I check on the guys, and if they're still loading gear or setting up, I jump in and help them. You know, Respect is earned, not given. So definitely in a leadership role, and also I'm very open and honest with them with what's going on. Now, they don't necessarily need to know everything in the business. They don't necessarily need to know everything behind the scenes. And it's not because I'm like keeping anything, is they're literally like, we don't need to know. There's nothing they have no role in that. They don't want a role in that, but I still let them know what's going on. I try to make sure that the schedule's easy, all that stuff. I try to mitigate as much stress as possible. Now, that sometimes means that I will unfortunately take on more stress, but it's easier, I find, when they're not complaining, not that they do, and they're completely content and humdrum, even if I'm pulling my hair out, because it just makes life easier on me.
And I'm going to cite two different folks I've heard give examples. One was a high-level marketing executive with Chick-fil-A. His name's Jeff Henderson. Is in his book, Know What You're For. He says, employees, and I know they're not employees, your bandmates and so on and so forth, but employees who know they're cared for, care for the customer.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically means, hey, if we take good care of people, they're going to take care of the people that we take care of. And the other fellow is a guy named Dave Ramsey that everybody's heard of. And Dave Ramsey says, hey, too often people get caught up in this idea of servant leadership as I need to do things for other people that they could and should be doing for themselves. He said, that's subservient leadership. In a leadership role, my job is to remove the barriers. I need to do the things that they can't do them for themselves so they can do the things that they can and should be doing for themselves better than they ever could without me. And that's what I heard you just explain, both of those things.
Well, of course. And then also right now, because I self-manage and, self-book and all that, you could apply that to that as well. I'm creating opportunities. So not saying that they necessarily couldn't book shows or whatever, but, I'm creating opportunities, giving them work, giving them a paycheck, all that stuff, but also treating them with respect. Because obviously, if I was unpleasant towards them, I don't think they would stick around no matter the opportunity. And you definitely see that with bands that have a million lineup changes. And unfortunately, if anybody's watching this that happens to, well, if the shoe fits, maybe, reevaluate in the mirror a little bit. It's not personal. It's just, look, I just see, again, going back to the cycle of abuse thing, and I can understand the stranglehold that they have on some people where they feel like I have to do this because this is the only way I can be famous or successful. But there's a lot of rich people who aren't famous, and there's a lot of famous people who aren't rich. So they're not equivalent or mutually exclusive at all. But that's why you see a lot of these people, they'll end up, alcoholics, drug addicts, or they'll end up killing themselves, is because of, you're throwing all your principles out the window.
Yep.
And that's also maybe a little bit of bad leadership as well, is that people are putting you in a position where it's almost like a power thing. And this is where I'm going to circle back to the top. You don't ever want to be a leader where you feel like, or where you make the person feel like they have no power, and you destroy their sense of self. And basically, like you said, the servitude thing, because you're going to make them not care. There's always a saying, like in jobs, like people don't quit jobs, they quit managers. It's if you have bad leadership, I think that's one of the worst things that can happen for a band or for a business is because then you create an environment of negativity, and then that energy is going to go somewhere, and then the cycle will just repeat. So I just think it's key. Main thing is basic tenet: treat people how you want to be treated. I check on everybody. It just makes life easier.
I love it. And it's not isolated. I mean, you referenced bands that have ever-changing lineups. I mean, it's the same way in industry, and you nailed it. Statistically, it's 2/3 of all turnover is tied to people who are leaving a manager. They're not leaving the company. They're leaving a specific supervisor or manager. 2/3. And that's just the way it is. So.
Definitely when I worked a day job, definitely dealt with that,
Yep. We're blessed today. I can think of 3 specific organizations that we work closely with that I've seen in the last, I'm going to say 10 years, but realistically, one, it's been over the course of 10 years that they've grown tenfold. The other, I've just known in the last 4.5 to 5 years, and I've watched them grow almost threefold in that time. And another has doubled their headcount in the last 6 months, all of which I've said it's just a matter of people understanding who you are and the way you care about your team. And you're going to grow massively. And they all have, because they all have high expectations. They all work in incredibly hard or technical industries. But when you've got a good culture, great people want to be around it. And hey, when it comes to music, I would much rather watch somebody that that puts their heart into it and it's a good person than the biggest name on the planet. I mean, there's some that I just don't want to see that sell out stadiums, and they're that buttholes. I don't want to deal with it. So,
well, see, to your point, you're talking about people buying into the culture. You want them to buy in. So now, if I'm up on stage and I'm not playing well, or I'm not singing well, or if I'm not playing or performing at a high level, then my guys might slack off a little bit. But I think in the case of them buying in, I'm fortunate that the 4 of us together, we always try to push us to be better, and if there's a night where somebody's a little off, because it happens, we're human, and it could be because you're not really feeling well, you didn't get enough sleep. Everybody in the band, and I made this a position, and I think being a good leader is listening to your people in the field. A good general listens to his troops. I want them to be able to approach me, to talk to me about anything. And also, I don't want them to be afraid to confront me and say, look, Christian, last night, you were a little flat when you were singing, for example. Now, again, sometimes that happens because of factors or whatever. Not everybody's perfect all the time singer. But if they point it out, then it means that something was a little bit more excessive than the norm. So instead of just, oh, yeah, whatever, yesing it off, I make it a point to fix it, because then when I'm held to account as their leader, when I can hold them to account and say, hey, this was a little like whatever, then they'll correct it as well, and then it'll make it stronger.
Yeah,
but
I love that. When we do, I'm sorry.
I was just saying, yeah, sorry, Wes. But I'm just saying, so to me, to get people to buy in, whether it's a corporate America or whatever, you have to make people care, or not have to make people. You got to show people that you care, and then they'll care. you know,
Absolutely.
and, not everybody, let's just be honest, not everybody's cut out to be in a leadership position, because even though for as much talking as I do a lot of listening, and I can talk and listen at the same time, which kind of sounds a little like, huh? Because like to me, I have a way where I can filter out the noise. I just try to pay attention to the signal. And again, I don't really care what people say. Not to say it kind of sounds like I'm contradicting myself with the listening thing. It's I pay attention to your actions, because sometimes what you say and what you do are two different things, and people might see that as like a negative thing, but it's like, no, not necessarily. Sometimes thoughts and feelings that we have in our head, it's hard to articulate into words, especially if you've never had to explain that feeling before. So usually if people repeat themselves like I tend to do, or if people kind of beat around the bush, you could be like, all right, stop beating around the bush and shut them down, or be like, okay, slow down. Let's get to the point. And this is being like a good, listener as a leader. And you kind of gotta almost fish or dig for what the real thing is, but also helping with that communication. It'll help them also better articulate their thoughts and feelings and their positions in the future. So
Yeah, I'm laughing and nodding because Cindy and I today, I didn't want to do this, but a big part of our business model today is we provide executive level coaching to business owners and so on and so forth. And again, didn't want to, because most coaches I ever seen are these folks that are just milking people and not providing any value. And that pisses me off so bad. But the reality was, I had to get really, really effective at listening to hear what they're really saying. And instead of saying, don't tell me about the labor pain, show me the baby, let's work through that. What about this? And asking a good question so we get to the underlying issue, rather than here's what the symptom is that we see at face level. I loved how you explained that.
Well, empathy is a skill. And I just think as I've gotten older and like taken on this role, I've learned a lot of pattern recognition. But, if something doesn't work, I need to figure out why.
Yep.
Like that's what keeps me up at night. It's not like regretting a decision I made or something like that. So you got to make a decision sometimes and stick with it, and that's the outcome. But it's basically like when something doesn't work, it's like, why didn't it work? And then that's where I kind of like get into the weeds. And then, but I'm also, I'm not afraid of people. So if somebody's upset or something and I can clearly see it, there's signs, most communication is nonverbal.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm saying like the words that come out of people's mouths, they don't necessarily mean or hold any weight or value behind them. It's the actions, the accountability. And again, and I always say, especially with the band, I hold myself to account, because if I don't hold myself to account to a high standard, because I'm not going to also elevate the people around me, but then I can't hold them to account. Because now you're creating the, if you want to get like down into like psychology, and again, I'm not, I'm probably going to explain this in really simple terms that, like any scientist on this or whatever watching it would scratch their head being like, whatever. But, basically, man, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Because I was thinking like
the psychology behind it.
Yeah.
Is the reality is when we can dig into it and we take good care of people buy in.
Yes. That's basically what it is. Yeah.
And now that brings me to the last formal question. And then I'm going to open it up to you to say, hey, what did I not ask you that I should have? The last formal question is really about advice. Now, whether it's your industry or anybody that's growing in their own industry, wanting to develop their professional resume, you said it earlier, I'm going to take the word leadership out. What advice would you give to somebody that's young, getting started and really looking to advance in their career and earn influence so they can have a positive impact?
Ask a lot of questions. Seek out people that are in positions above you or in higher levels of their career or whatever. Get in touch with them. Ask them a lot of questions. And if somebody asks why are you asking questions, it means you're over the target.
Yeah, and Christian, in your experience, I wanted to ask you this earlier. In my experience over the last 25, 30 years, the people that have had the most success, but also have been the most impactful in my life, have been the ones that were most willing to take the time and offer feedback when I asked. So if I wouldn't ask questions, I wouldn't have got those answers. What's that been like for you?
Well, I mean, you don't know if you don't ask. If you don't ask, the answer is no. You know, you'd be surprised, like, especially, you know, you always see like bands, like people, like people be like, for example, they'll be like, they'll hide from their fans. And it's like, it's not that they're hiding. You know, I've experienced this. You get a bunch of people that come up to you, and, you know, that's great. They want to be like, oh, we love your music. We love you, whatever, sign. And but like what really is going to stick out is if you come up to me and you ask questions outside of that. And so that's why I'm saying a lot of these guys, they're definitely reachable via social media and all that stuff. Just anything you want to, I mean, obviously be respectful. Don't ask like whatever, but I'm talking about career wise questions. I'm sure most of these guys would be willing to give advice or at least, you know, answer your questions or kind of help point you in a direction. I mean, I certainly do when somebody asks me a question. I mean, it's not a secret. I'm not a gatekeeper. I don't need to hold on to my slice of the pie. There's plenty of pie to go around.
And let's go make another pie if we need to.
Yes.
It works out just fine. What have I not asked you that I should?
I think we pretty much covered a lot of business stuff. I don't think that there's yeah, I don't think there's really anything. It's just a basic overview. I definitely like what you said about leadership. I think it's key. And then also we can maybe make another point that it also applies to the audience as well. You know, me being a front man, you want to take the audience on a journey, and you know, you got to basically control the crowd, so to speak, from the back to the front. You know, you got to take them on a journey, and that's hard. You know, again, that's a skill that has to be, I think, needs to be learned. You know, empathy and public speaking and all that stuff. I think that all applies here. You know,
Absolutely. Now, Christian, the last plug, I'll wrap up with some stuff about Dove Development and the purpose and values and some of the things, but talk about what Patreon members get through your channels, because you've got some pretty cool stuff that you've launched. Talk about that a little bit, because the links are in the show notes. You do some pretty cool stuff there.
Well, so what I'm going to do is with the Patreon especially is it's my way of making, or not making, having the fans have an ability to become a shareholder, so to speak, in the Christian Shields band. Now, you're not necessarily buying stocks, and you're not necessarily buying, you know, you're not buying, you know, one of those cryptocurrency coins or anything like that. I don't know why the word was escaping me, but anyway, it's basically you're investing money in the band, and I can in real time kind of gauge feedback of, like, especially song ideas I'm working on. And again, this is going to expand into different things as it grows over time. But right now it's, you know, pretty basic stuff of getting behind the scenes stuff. You know, obviously I'm pretty open to messages on social media and stuff right now, but maybe at some point it's not feasible. So maybe that's where the gatekeeping would come in, where unless you're a Patreon member, you know, because there's just not enough time in the day sometimes to talk to everybody. And, you know, maybe we'll do some live streams on there. You know, basically you think of it like patron of the arts, you know? So, you know, your name gets to go in credits of videos and all that stuff. And again, there's some things I'm keeping close to the chest that I don't want to say, because I'm not a person that says things before they happen. So I don't want to be like, oh yeah, we're working on this, and then it doesn't happen, you know? So it'll grow over time, but the more members we have, the faster it'll grow.
Yeah, the parts that I've dug into, and you shared a little bit more in the Hops Metal Show about, here's at one level, there's some pretty cool access to where you've got a spot at a show anytime you come, where to your point with being able to engage. But what I love about what you're doing with that, it's not terribly different than what Cindy and I've done through our Complete Leading at the Next Level program, is how can we give access to people? And we can't get to everybody all the time. I wish we could. You can't, we can't. It's just, that's the part of life, right? But how do we, at the lowest price point possible, to make sure that we can keep our lights on? We sleep inside. I'm a capitalist. I like eating food and sleeping indoors, greedy shit like that. It's just where I'm at. But how can we do it and serve the most people at the highest level? And that's how you're doing it, through your industry. It's not dissimilar from what we do. It's just in a different industry.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of tools out there that are outside the quote unquote orthodoxy. And, you got to try in. That's fine if you want to do it as a hobby, but this isn't a hobby to me. This is my career. So you can't necessarily leave money on the table.
Mhm.
And also, I think you're doing the fans a disservice if you're not creating, things that they like. You know what I mean? I mean,
Yep.
they'll go with you wherever you go, especially, if you walk them through it. But, I just think that this is the best way moving forward for right now, to get more people involved, give them some skin in the game, so to speak, but also let them get some stuff that nobody else can get. Again, you're investing.
Yep.
Your return on your investment. I mean, it's not like, unfortunately, it's not necessarily going to pay you a dividend like, a regular stock would, like Tesla or Apple. But what you're getting from it is you're getting, entertainment and songs that you like, and hopefully cool experiences that you'll enjoy. And if people don't like them, then they'll stop buying it. Simple as that. People vote with their wallet. I don't know why this is a controversial thing. Money makes the rules.
Yep.
It's a song
100%.
title. Maybe I should write a song like that.
Yep. Indeed. So I'll bring this to a close and say, Christian, this has been a cool conversation. And I'm going to say, anybody that's tuned in, well, this is more of a business leadership focus. My point is, you've shared so many things that cross industry that break down industry barriers that apply in every sector, because we're always dealing with people. If we treat people right, if we give more than we expect to get, good things happen from all of it. One of the things Cindy and I always wrap up when we close this with is, if you've got interest, if you've got value from this, we've got a full program called Leading at the Next Level, where over the last, since late 2018, we've written several lessons each month. Now it's more than 170 full lessons, all approved for continuing education credit through Human Resource Certification Institute, the Society for Human Resource Management, and a couple others. But we've done that with the focus of, how do you lead more effectively in a way that you can capture tangible return on investment? How do we impact the teams that you lead? If you want to kick the tires for a 14-day trial, there's $1 processing fee to get that started. There's a link to that in the show notes, wherever you're accessing it. And there's some stuff like the Leading with Clear Purpose book, the Values Advantage book that's coming up, and so on. Christian, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. This was a very cool conversation. I love the music that you put out, but more importantly, I love how you treat it like a business, because it truly is.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's great to have this conversation. I never really, everybody always asks me about music. They don't necessarily ask me about business and leadership stuff. So, hence the slip up there where lost my train of thought. It's just, it's not something that's necessarily at the front of my brain. It's always in the back of my mind. So, I apologize for that, but I just think that, it's cool to have these types of conversations, because it's different for me. And also it shows maybe the fans a different type of conversation that maybe they want to have with me, but they don't know what type of questions to ask or whatever. So again, it's all good. Thank you for having me.
You bet, Christian. Love the conversation. Make sure you follow Christian on all the different links that are in the show notes. Catch up with him, and make sure you get a CD, get some merch, and make sure you see him live when there's an opportunity. Look forward to seeing you guys soon. Make it a great day. God bless.